We are experiencing a moment of tremendous breakdown. And when I say we, I don't just mean Americans. I don't just mean North Americans. I mean really all human beings. We're going through a moment of planetary transformation. And I don't know about you, but the categories that I was used to deploying in order to make sense of the social world no longer work. They no longer provide me with the sort of understanding that I used to think I had of where, society in the United States of America was heading, of the inevitable social change that would unfold. And, many things have happened over the past decade or so that I would say signal progress. But there seems to be a coinciding regressive movement. And the podcast that you're about to listen to is my attempt with a few of my good friends, our attempt to come to terms with this transformation. And the locus of our attention in this podcast is Jordan B. Peterson. And Peterson is a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology. And he has, in the last year or so, exploded onto the scene and become a public intellectual who's speaking what a lot of people consider to be truth to a kind of orthodoxy of thought. And whether or not you agree with him, it's pretty clear that he is making waves. And those waves are impacting all of us, right? And I don't know how many other people experience what me and Adam Robert and Jesse Estrin have been experiencing, but it seems like a lot of other people are having the same sort of tensions arise within them. Adam is a doctoral student at a graduate school in philosophy here in the Bay Area, and Jesse is a therapist as well as a social activist working in some prisons here in the Bay Area on behalf of racial justice and gender justice. And the three of us sat down a few days ago to try to sort through what is a really fraught conversation, if it can even be called a conversation. I think ultimately what we're trying to do is carve out a new space wherein a conversation can take place, where the sorts of ideas that Peterson is attempting to articulate can be heard by the left, and where the left can respond, I think, in an adequate way to Peterson's criticisms. Now, Adam and Jesse and myself, we're all white men, and it's important to put that out on the table and acknowledge it. But at the same time, I hope that our listeners, even if they are critical of Peterson and if Peterson's approach and ideas concern them, that they're willing to listen to what we have to say about Peterson, because it's very easy to just read some, I would say, of some of the unfair media coverage of him on the left and then have a distorted picture of what he's actually trying to say and what he's actually all about. I don't agree with his politics, but I find him to be a worthy opponent for the left to sharpen its dialectical sword. I've noticed, a lot of people have noticed that over the past little while, the cultural power that the left used to have in the media and in the universities and academia, it's beginning to wane. And this whole intellectual dark web phenomenon is a symptom of that waning cultural influence on the left. And in terms of political influence, the left has been in trouble for a long time. We are losing elections. And I want to stop losing. And I think Peterson presents us with an opportunity on the left to do some deep reflection and to, sharpen our ability to respond to someone who I think is a kind of conservative that is worthy of our attention. Not that we have to agree with him, but that we need to respond to his point of view. So I hope that you are activated by the conversation that we have and are compelled to join us in this dialogue. I'm here with a couple friends of mine who have been going through an experience these past several months, perhaps, and it seems to have been crescendoing in the last week even. Anyone who's plugged into politics in North America and pays the slightest bit of attention to social media and even legacy media now is familiar with Jordan Peterson. And my friends here, Jesse and Adam and myself, have all been struggling to make sense of the reaction to Peterson. I don't think any of us actually agree with everything he says, but we're interested in what he's saying and we want to engage with him. So the three of us wanted to have a conversation to unpack what it is exactly that we do find compelling about Peterson, as well as what we find revealing about the reaction. And I know, Jesse, you were someone that was very involved in a lot of social justice work and came across Peterson several months ago and have been on quite a journey over the last little bit here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what it is that drew you to Peterson and the sort of inner conflicts that you've been experiencing?
Sure, I'd love to. So I've been involved in social justice work for a long time, both personally as well as in larger groups. I'm a psychotherapist intern, marriage family therapist intern. I teach at a well-known California state prison, and I'm on the board of a few foundations who are oriented specifically towards social justice with a lens towards racial justice and gender justice. And so as someone who's been raised by parents who are strongly left, oriented, liberal leftists, it's kind of just the space I've been in my whole life, as well as most of my friends and family, sharing the worldview that would be considered leftist and pretty far leftist, I would say. So the first time I heard about Peterson, I was in a conversation with a friend, and he started bringing up Peterson and some of his ideas. I remember he used the phrase social justice warriors, and I got triggered. I got really startled, and I started pushing back a little bit and asking him what he meant by that. Was he being facetious? Was he being ironic, or was he being serious? And it was a really provocative conversation, and luckily we had a while to unpack it. And then I immediately came across somebody, Jordan Greenhall, who I really respect. I was reading a blog piece, a Medium piece by him, and he brought up Jordan Peterson and embedded a link towards that Kathy Newman interview. Mm-hmm. So I watched that, and I just kind of got hooked. I realized that regardless of what he was saying, how he was saying it, he's actually a smart guy. So I definitely got intrigued, and I started watching a few more videos and then following some stuff online and reading articles, and I was sharing him with some friends, and we were all trying to kind of understand him. And the interesting thing was that although I didn't agree with some of the things he said, and was really challenged by him, there was this really strange thing of, I don't know how to describe it. I felt relieved or refreshed. There was something fresh and invigorating and intriguing about it. And I think it's because he's tapping into currents and streams of feelings that are happening in our culture and in our communities that in our very PC-oriented, politically correct-oriented, especially in the left circles, we're not ever allowed to voice and name. And I think he's naming things a lot of people think, but they don't speak out loud. And whether you love him or hate him, there's something refreshing about that. And so some friends and I, including you, have been kind of trying to explore and understand what he's saying. I wanted to understand him better to also be able to push back and argue. But what's been really interesting is there have been some articles put out about, the problematic pieces, the problematic things he says, the phrases, the uses, some of his real pushback against credos of the left. And so what I'm starting to see is a lot of my friends and family have extraordinarily strong reactions to him that is disconcerting or startling. I'm trying to understand this moment because it's starting to become something larger. He's obviously gained a lot of attention and a lot of people are following him, but it's starting to kind of bring this almost Grand Canyon. This started as a fissure or a crack, and it's the strangest thing because as someone who still very much identifies as a leftist and a liberal, I'm finding myself feeling pushed further and further away from a lot of my friends and people in my community who are quite angry and upset at him. And I get the sense they're not actually listening or reading or engaging with some of his ideas. It's like there's certain things that catch them and it's feeling like a rift on the left that's emerging.
Right. It's a rift that I think was already emerging long before anyone knew who Jordan Peterson was.
That's right.
And the left isn't one monolithic entity. There's always a lot of infighting. And I think over the past couple of years, that rift has continued to grow. And Peterson, I think, is emblematic of that. The response to Peterson is emblematic of that. There's a certain sector of the left which maybe leans more libertarian that seems to want to engage with his ideas. And then a certain sector of the left that's more committed to a kind of social justice work that leans toward identity politics, that wants to just dismiss him and hope he goes away without engaging. Mm-hmm. So, Adam, you and I and Jesse have been talking about Peterson, and it's clear that I don't agree with much of what Peterson has to say. And there's certain ways that he frames scientific issues. Like, I think we need to be specific here, right? There are certain scientific sounding statements that Peterson wants to make, or maybe they're legitimately scientific statements about the difference between men and women and how that might explain some of the gender pay gap that is taken as a fact that is wrong and needs to be fixed by the left. So when you hear Peterson talking about issues like that, what is it that you think he's getting at that the left is unwilling to hear?
Well, I don't know. I need to step back a little bit further before I start kind of saying what I think about specific issues like that. Mm-hmm. I got kind of pulled into this whole conversation because I was paying attention to a larger set of, today in Congress, they were having this hearing on free speech on college campuses. There was a whole panel discussion with various professors, and one of them was Burt Weinstein, who's the now ex-professor from Evergreen, who, basically can't teach on his own campus anymore for reasons that are related to the Peterson issue. But I first heard of Jordan Peterson because I was kind of following all of those events and got kind of intrigued by what was going on campuses. And that's where I first heard of him. And it's never been, for me, a question of what is he saying? Do I agree with it? Do I kind of sign on to this whole sort of, psychological / Darwinian / Jungian kind of archetypal psychology that's really the center of what he's doing. Mm-hmm. But what was fascinating for me was this huge disjuncture between what he was saying and what media outlets were reporting him as saying.
Right.
And
the famous Kathy Newman response. So what you're saying is
right. So Kathy Newman,
some...
the BBC interview was just a kind of a very large example of a series of events that had kind of gone on for quite some time. And so for me, this whole discussion is kind of about that phenomenon. That, you know, because if you read some of these articles that people have written about him, he's so closely allied with the alt-right. He's a Nazi, so on and so forth. He's gaining popularity. These are things that concern me. Yeah. As a person, I don't, you know, I have a kind of a hair trigger response for those kinds of things, and I zero in on them because I think they are real issues. But then when you dig into what he's saying and what he's doing, it doesn't seem to be anything like that. And so for me, it became about tracking this ever increasing gap between what various people are actually saying and how they're being represented in various media outlets, and just a complete and kind of irresponsible and borderline morally corrupt or unethical just inability to deal with a person's position. And I think it's important that we understand and really be able to nail down a person's position, whether we agree with it or not, because that's how the dialogue proceeds. And I don't see that dialogue even being possible right now. And I see a lot of the criticisms of Jordan Peterson being in the not even wrong category. It's not that, do we support Nazis? No, nobody does. What kind of person is that? The question is, what is this person actually saying?
The dynamic since Trump was elected president of the United States seems to be that anyone who doesn't toe the party line is somehow helping Trump or supporting Trump. And anyone that is even conservative is enabling Nazis, if not a Nazi themselves. That's the kind of dynamic that I've started to recognize, is that there is no longer any room for discussion with people who might think that actually society hasn't unfolded in a sustainable way in the era of Obama, let's say, that we need to be more careful about certain utopian social justice narratives. Even if we agree on what's wrong, there's not always a simple answer in terms of how to fix it. And in attempting to fix some injustices, we may actually cause more harm.
But that's what I think is so fascinating about this, is because one of the things that I actually appreciate about Jordan Peterson is that he's very concerned about the emergence of authoritarianism and the emergence of fascism. The left, the people who are criticizing him, are very concerned about the emergence of authoritarianism and the emergence of fascism. So we all agree that there are certain kind of global signals that are coming out from different sectors of the world that are coming out. You know, we've seen it in different elections in different countries, in France and in Italy and in the United Kingdom and here in the United States, potentially connected to Donald Trump's presidency. We've seen Vladimir Putin kind of become leader for life. We're seeing that in China as well. So there are these signals of reactionary groups and sort of things that if you're watching, if you know your history a little bit, these are kind of precursors that should put you. Let's pay attention to this.
Feels a bit like the 1930s.
Let's go into that and look at that, but let's not call everybody a Nazi immediately, because if we do, then if there are actual fascist elements in society, then we'll miss them, and those words won't mean anything when we need them.
I think that's something that Peterson is really pointing out is the rising polarization that's occurring in our country, and ideology, and the capacity for people to get possessed by an ideology and start to lose track. And for me, I was so in the left bubble. I was so in an echo chamber that I didn't even realize I was. I mean, it sounds almost funny now, but with Peterson, it's spreading a conversation where people are starting to look and realize that actually sometimes if you don't toe the line, if you're not 100% on all of these ideas that you'll be questioned, and it will actually, you'll start to see emerging some kind of a polarization that's actually ideologically backed, losing the capacity to actually hear each other, to engage with ideas and thoughts. And what's amazing is that actually there are folks on the left who do the same thing, whether it's, again, on the left or the right, but it's the polarization is what's dangerous. It's a real difficulty, of course, exacerbated by a lot of things like social media and the forms of communication we have now. But I think that's what a lot of folks on the left are starting to grapple with because of Peterson. He's playing a really important role, in my opinion, as being a provocateur, not a provocateur, but what he's saying and what he's sharing is provocative, and it's causing a lot of conversation and dialogue to happen. And in that sense, I think it's a really positive thing.
Well, when I was listing my examples of, potentially authoritarian or already authoritarian kind of emerging places in the world of authoritarianism, they were all kind of, right-wing examples. But I think what this conversation about Jordan Peterson is showing us that there's a lot of strong authoritarianism on the left too. It just expresses itself in a kind of a different way. And so it's had me, not just Peterson, but a variety of things, has had me thinking about the kind of cultural power or soft power or media power that traditionally left people and organizations hold in this country. And I think that's what you're seeing when this psychologist from Canada, who's ostensibly just kind of a Jungian, as far as I can tell, no more, no less, more upsetting than any other Jungian I've ever come across. But the way that narrative is being enforced is a kind of sort of soft authoritarianism. This is the story. This is what the world looks like. This is how we're supposed to interpret it. And so it doesn't have kind of marches in the streets and shows of physical power like that, but it's saying in a kind of discursive space, we're regulating what you can think. We're regulating what you can say. And this is the story. And I'm not against the idea of institutions or, even sort of venerable publications like the New York Times holding a kind of privileged place in a discourse sometimes. But then you have to go in and check how good is this representation really? And anybody can go and check that now easier than ever. And when the representation is that off, you have to wonder, are the people who are writing these stories just incompetent? Or are they just taking a paycheck because that's what their bosses need them to say? Or is this like a kind of a deliberate move to enforce a narrative?
And to be fair, New York Times has published a number of pieces, op-eds that were, what's her name, Weiss or Barry?
Barry Weiss.
Barry Weiss, about the intellectual dark web. And I thought there were a few pieces that were more open to Peterson and the intellectual dark web folks. But there is a tendency, I think, on the left who feel really threatened and are so quick to catch on to and name, some like certain things and pigeonhole Peterson into a far right figure who is extremely dangerous. And the common argument I come across is that his ideas, his thoughts, his arguments are being picked up by alt-right and fascists and racists, and that he's feeding a very far-right movement. And I wonder, I think you or someone had posed a question of, I wonder how many people has Peterson moved far to the right, or how many people have kind of maybe moved more towards the center?
I think that's an open question that there could be some empirical research done on that to determine whether or not he's pulling people away from white nationalism back to the center and towards a normal, respectable form of conservatism, or whether he's a gateway drug and red pilling people and welcoming them into a kind of more extreme right-wing form of thought. And I think what I appreciate about Peterson is that he does have some very valid critiques of the left and the way that it operates on university campuses, the way that it operates in some of the major media outlets, legacy media outlets. And there is a power there, consolidated power. He'll point out that it's seeping its way into corporate HR offices as well. And I think neoliberal capitalism would love that for identity politics to catch on, because it divides us up more and prevents us from forming a kind of solidarity around economic inequality. And instead we're infighting. All the people that have nothing are fighting with one another about who has a little bit more of nothing. But the issue I have with Peterson is he's shifting all our attention onto the failings of the left. And the left does have power over large sectors of academia and Hollywood and the media, but not the police departments, not the military, not any branch of government in the United States right now. So in terms of cultural power, yeah, the left has some of that. In terms of actual physical power, guns and missiles and jail cells, the left is not in power. And there's a resurgent right-wing movement that has taken power, physical power over the guns in this country and in many other countries around the world right now. And I think that Peterson is not really directing enough of his concern for authoritarian movements in the right direction.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, a pushback I often get from folks around Peterson is people will say, why are you attacking the left so much? Like, why aren't you focusing on the right, on the far right?
The left is really good at attacking itself, and it's not so good at attacking the right.
Right. I mean, I would say there's truth to that. For me, again, this might sound really funny to people. I haven't really attacked the left. I've never really even seen the problematic aspects of the left. I've been so deep in that deep fight for racial justice, for gender justice, for diversity, for inclusion. And those are obviously really important, such important things that I'm not going to give up on. But the fact is, I'm now starting to question, and I don't know the answer, but I'm starting to wonder what role some of this far left, the political correctness, the tone policing, policing language, who can say this, who can't say that, has actually participated and been a part of this rise of some of the far right and Trump. I mean, I know we focus on Russia and there's a lot of elements at play. It's very complex, but I'm starting to question, okay, did we really play a role? Did the left mess this up? Or is there a piece of the responsibility that we need to look at? And have we had that dialogue? I don't really think so.
Well, I have two questions about that. One is that, isn't it, and this is something Peterson talks about, it's the same identity politics on the extreme left and the extreme right. And in that sense, it's the identity politics that's organizing both of them that's unhelpful, that isn't getting us to where we need to go. So I think that's one thing to look at, is that there is this kind of shared set of tactics and a kind of an ideology just shot in different directions, but it's that ideology that maybe needs to be uprooted. And then the second thing is a question for you. You have any of your commitments to any of these social justice causes actually changed because you've listened to this man? Do you care less about other people? Do you care less about the social justice work that you're doing? Because for me, whether or not I agree with him or people like him or whatever his arguments are, none of the arguments that he makes about there are fundamental trait and mental differences between men and women, any of these things, they don't actually reorient me ethically to other people, because none of those things are, I don't hang anything on what your interests are really, or what you want to do with your life in terms of your moral value to me.
Absolutely. And I mean, of course, something that's interesting is, as I was diving into Peterson, I was also reading a book called When They Call You a Terrorist by Patrisse Cullors, who's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And it's a phenomenal book. It's a beautiful book. It's her memoir. It tells her story. She grew up in Los Angeles, was born, I believe, the year after I was born. I also grew up in LA. We had extremely different experiences. And hearing about her experience as a queer Black woman growing up in Los Angeles and her experience with her older brother, in the criminal justice system as someone with mental illness. I was extremely touched. So I felt like these last number of months, I'm absolutely just as committed to fighting for rights and equalities and justice for all groups of people, especially those who have been oppressed systemically for a long time in this country. I think it's really important to recognize white privilege. It's really important to recognize male privilege. I think these go without saying. In my opinion, they go without saying. They're like fundamental bedrock assumptions. But what's emerging now is this idea that, Jonathan Haidt, who's a really interesting guy, he's I think, political psychologist or a moral psychologist, but he talks about how the left actually doesn't understand the right in the way that the right understands the left. And his point is that now it's pretty well known, you can't really argue that the education system, universities are very left. It's very, would you say that, Matt? Dominated more by liberals than by conservatives?
The humanities departments are. And I think there are plenty of scientists who lean left too, but in terms of like the funding for like the STEM fields with the military industrial complex and stuff, it's a little more complicated. But by and large, yeah, universities are leftist.
So what he would say is that a lot of conservatives will come to universities and they'll have been exposed to conservative ideas, conservative thinkers, and then they will get more of the liberal perspectives while they're at university. So, and then they'll continue kind of listening and reading conservative thoughts and ideas. So they actually come out with some ideas around, what folks on the right and folks on the left are thinking about, are talking about. But if you grow up in a liberal home and you're just reading liberal and learning from the liberal viewpoint, and then you go to university, which is predominated mainly by liberal teachers and professors, you're then getting more of a liberal diet. And then you come out and you actually, I think folks on the left just genuinely don't understand.
Yeah, they don't get it.
They don't get it. And Jonathan Haidt talks about morality, like moral.
Because the other part there is that if you're on that trajectory of growing up, you're also growing up in a coastal urban area, which, tends to lean liberal family, liberal education. And then what kind of job do you go on to get? You go to a tech company, you go into journalism, you go work for the New York Times, you go to any of these kind of larger institutions in society that also lean in that same direction. So that's why I'm wondering is that it's really possible that New York Times article that just came out about Jordan Peterson was their level best attempt to read what he's going on, because it's a building full of people who had the same biographical experience that you did. Right. They grew up liberal, they went to a liberal university, and then they went to work for a liberal company, and everybody around them in that whole period had the same kind of life. And so that's how everything looks to them. So that kind of, all of those self-correcting mechanisms that you would hope would come into play, somebody with a different perspective, this is how, friend groups operate ideally. I have a certain view of myself. I go and get that mirrored with other people, and people kind of let me know if I really am who I think I am, and I grow from it. But if none of those mechanisms can come into play, then you really get this, like you're saying, like a completely one-sided perspective. And whether or not that perspective is better or worse is kind of irrelevant in this context, because it's not going to be able to engage with anything outside of itself.
Right.
And so part of what I see happening is, because it can't engage with anything outside of itself, it's trying to convert the entire world into itself, into something it can deal with. And because it can't really engage with difference, it needs to convert difference into one of the categories that it already understands. And so if it's a guy like Peterson who falls outside of that framework, then really the only option is because the ideas can't be assimilated within the understanding that you have to turn that person into a monster or some kind of oddity,
which is
to keep them out.
That's exclusivity. It's actually the opposite of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. It's not viewpoint diversity. It's
right.
A different. It's excluding certain points of view because they're uncomfortable, and they make people feel, uncomfortable about certain certain dynamics and maybe even certain scientific facts that we may not like, but they're true anyway.
Right.
And we have to deal, given our values and what we hope for society, in an equitable, just society, we have to consider what the facts are and then move forward. I want to make a distinction here that hasn't been made yet, which is that when we talk about the left and the radical left, and say that the radical left is obsessed with identity politics, I think there's at least two factions on the left.
Should we say something about what we think identity politics is, just because it's another one of those terms that's now used for all kinds of things? And as I was just saying, I think identity politics is a problem on the left and the right. But
Clearly.
what is identity politics?
Well, on the left and on the right now, it's I think a form of political discourse that puts someone's group identity before their individuality. And in the United States of America, there's been a history with a very specific set of conditions that have led to an array of identities, group identities, that are now vying for political representation and economic resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a certain faction on the left that I would call the neoliberal left, which wants to reduce politics to that struggle of different groups for political representation and economic power, and wants to make sure that there are equal representation of sexual orientation and ethnicity and race in the executive boards and in the powerful positions that run our government.
Right.
And that as long as there are more black CEOs, more female CEOs, then everything will be great because we've achieved equality then.
Right. Well, so one version of the idea is that whatever the demographic breakdown of the United States is in terms of just men and women, different ethnic groups,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, however you want to slice that pie, that all of the other major institutions should have a proportionate representation of those people. So in other words, the kind of the guiding understanding of this kind of identity politics to me is that, let's just make up some numbers. It's 50% men, 50% women. How many percent white? 50, 60% white at this point. Let's say, 10% everything else. And then whatever that distribution is,
Mm-hmm.
every organization should mirror that kind of distribution. And if it doesn't mirror that distribution, the reason for that mirroring is some kind of oppression, whether it's racial oppression or sexual discrimination or anything. That is the explanatory force behind the difference between the demographic of the whole and the demographic of the little individual pieces that are running around.
Right.
I think that's kind of the idea.
Yeah. So there's a distinction that Jordan Peterson makes that I think goes back to what I've gathered is it goes back to the debates several decades ago around affirmative action between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And he's all for equality of opportunity.
I think everybody can agree that if you're against equality of opportunity, then that's a problem.
Right.
Then I'm for pushing that person
Right.
out.
It's not a reasonable position to
It's not,
have
right.
and to be a member of a functioning society.
Yeah.
Now, the issue of equality of outcome, the way that I would say the neoliberal left frames equity, and this is a point where I do agree with Peterson, that leads us to some very dangerous places,
Mm-hmm.
where the state gets charged with having to somehow enforce with some large bureaucracy the number of people who get placed in certain jobs so that a quota is met. And, just in terms, even if we thought that was a good idea, that the state should be deciding how many of each kind of person
Right.
gets to be in each type
those
of
metrics,
job.
how can you measure those?
Even
things?
if we thought that some version of that might be a good idea, it's the practical issue of actually doing it leads to all sorts of injustices.
Well, the logical truth there is that it cuts against the individual's freedom to choose what they want to do.
Yeah. And I've heard people on the left say that nobody on the left is actually arguing for equality of outcome. But
I've been in
I see
not
it.
classrooms, but I've been in conference presentations and other kind of scholarly events where that was what was the topic, equality of outcome.
Right. So I agree. I think that is what people, that distinction isn't made usually. And there's just this talk of a need for equality. And, you know, in general, of course, I'm for equality. But when you parse out what equality actually means, you have to make this distinction because, you know, people are different. We differ more individually within any group, all white people, all black people, all women. Any individual will differ more from any other individual in that group than they will between groups.
Yeah.
Right. So,
but this is a good segue into kind of where I think things get not for me necessarily, but in the larger social conversation, this is where things get dicey because you're accepting this truth which comes from our statistical understanding of individuals and groups. So you're kind of opening up to the truth of that kind of knowledge and understanding, which says that for the most part, the difference between individuals is greater than the difference between groups. So two men are more likely to differ from one another than men as a whole versus women as a whole, which is why this is the logical rationale for treating people as individuals and not groups, because you don't know who's in front of you. You don't know what their capacities are. You don't know what their traits are. And nothing that you know about their group in advance will prepare you to accurately identify what that person can actually do. But that kind of opens the door to some of the other things that Peterson says about the difference between men and women, for example. And how biological is that? How innate is that? How socially determined is that? How economically determined is that? And I've listened to him talk about these things just because the way he's been reported on is so extreme that it sounds like, I've even seen people on social media like say that, guys like Jordan Peterson are watching that show, The Handmaid's Tale, and taking notes and going, oh, this is some really good, this is good stuff, good material. This is what we're drawing from. And if you haven't seen that show, it's about the emergence of an extremely oppressive theocracy in a near dystopian future where women have no rights and they're basically like sort of breeding cattle.
Baby machines.
Baby machines. So, okay, that's concerning. But then you go back and look at what he's saying, and it doesn't seem to be anything like that. But it does leave open the question of, are there not, in fact, differences? And I think it's silly to say that there are no differences between men and women, and that those things don't impact the kind of life choices that they make. And I think it's unethical and frankly unevolved to flatten those differences and just pretend that with the right kind of social engineering, you can make any human just like any other human. I don't see us as interchangeable in that way. And what was wrong with that conversation in the past was that you created this binary where one half of the binary, the male half, dominated and was privileged over the other half. Where the issue isn't that there's difference, the issue is how do you represent those differences economically and socially and legally? And so for me, it's kind of a better thing to elevate whatever it is ends up being, quote unquote, female typical behavior, elevating that in society rather than saying, no, everybody can actually kind of become what a man is typically. I think there's something kind of weird and sexist about that.
I mean, I do think, to your point, we have to remember the context, which is men in this case have dominated women for so long. And Peterson really pushes back about patriarchy. Obviously, his whole lobster theme, and he's pointing to
Can
the
you explain the lobster thing to me? I get that it has something to do with serotonin, and we have a similar neurological structure to lobsters. Everything sounds good. Why is this so upsetting?
Right. Well, I don't know if I'll get it exactly right when you guys jump in, but I think the whole point of it is that our brain functions, our nervous system runs on serotonin in the same way that the lobsters did, however long ago that was, 1 billion years or 500 million years ago. And so our nervous system is wired biologically with the same kind of grooves as crustaceans such as the lobsters have. And so that we're actually wired for forms of hierarchy, social hierarchy. He talks about the chimps and how there'll be alphas and then the submissive alphas or whatnot. And I think his point is simply that, and it dovetails into one of his main critiques, which is about postmodernism and, this whole idea of relative truths and everything being socially constructed. So he's saying that this argument from the left or the far left around patriarchy as a socially constructed thing by men to dominate women is actually inaccurate. Maybe it's a combination of the two, but he says there's definitely a biological basis for it that goes back a long time, and which you can see in the animal kingdom. They're not human, they're not thinking, they're not socially creating cultures, but they're self-organizing into forms of hierarchies that, and so he goes into a whole difference between dominant hierarchies versus hierarchies based on competence.
Right. And I've seen some leftist biologists try to have a gotcha moment by saying something like the chordata branch and the arthropod branch diverged before lobsters became a species, right? So that the idea that there's not a direct relationship between humans and lobsters, and that totally misses the point, actually. The point is that human beings are animals and we have an evolutionary lineage, and that the stereotype of the postmodern relativist is that that human nature is a blank slate and it's totally constructed by society and power. And Peterson is saying, no, actually we're organisms and we have an evolutionary history and we can study hierarchies in other species and learn something about human hierarchies. And one of the points that really hit me hard in terms of making me question my own assumptions is when he talks about how capitalism did not invent hierarchy and oppression.
But that can't be that can't be like groundbreaking for you. There were hierarchies way before capitalism. I
get that, but I got that for sure. We can blame agriculture and the agricultural revolution maybe, but just the idea that the groupthink on the left, and I would say the socialist left, which is different than the neoliberal left, is that capitalism is the source of all problems. And if we could just get rid of capitalism, then we'd live in some wonderful utopia. And the danger of that kind of utopian thinking is that it totally negates the fact that human beings are animals and that there are certain tendencies that are innate that tend to produce dominance hierarchies. Right. And when, I certainly don't think it's valid to blame Marx for the 100 million deaths at the hands of Stalin and Mao and the attempts to institute communism in the 20th century.
But let me ask you
that. Marx was too utopian, I think.
Marx was too utopian. Peterson constantly, he loves Dostoevsky. He loves, I think as a depth psychologist, and a Jungian, he's really focused in on the shadow, on the tragic dimension of life, on the capacity for suffering, on the malevolence that exists in the world, on the malevolence that exists within all human beings. So he has a real eye for shadow and an eye for the capacity for humans to go dark and brutal. And so he's constantly wary of ideology and so he'll talk a lot about in the 20th century, and he'll talk about in Soviet Union and Russia and like the communism and Maoist China. What's your sense, Matt? He's constantly pointing to a possession state, an ideological, like a train that's gone off its track and resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. is your sense you don't think Marx is responsible for that, but do you think there's some comparison when he keeps talking about the radical left, the far left today? Do you think there's something in that, assertion, in that question, in that wariness?
No, I don't actually. I think, like I said at the beginning, he's focusing too much of his ire on the social justice warriors in the universities, thinking that they're about to take over the world, when I'm way more worried about who's in the White House right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm way more worried about resurgent neo-Nazism in Europe and in the United States. These seem to be forces which are way more willing to kill than any of the social justice activists. And I know that the Antifa and that whole thing, it's like, why is the left being violent? This kind of died down. I haven't heard much from the Antifa folks recently. But
the reason I kind of agree with what you're saying right now is because I don't know who the Antifa is really, but their training videos were circulating on Twitter for a while, and I'm not worried about whatever violence they might be able to, I'm concerned about violence as much as the next person, but they're, compared to some of the organization and skill and equipment and training I've seen from various right-wing militias, the Antifa, I don't know. I don't know what to make of that, and I kind of agree with you. And that was Russell Brand's point too when he interviewed Jordan Peterson. We were in super saturated Jordan Peterson territory, but he said the same thing. He said, "Do you really think that these kind of postmodern academic professors are more dangerous or let's take out danger entirely. Let's talk about influential or powerful than GlaxoSmithKline, than like large multinational corporations, than people who are really kind of reorganizing global economic systems in their favor. Are they really the issue? Yeah, it's a little annoying, and yeah, there's a lot of empirically sort of circumspect statements flying around, but is this really where the fire is? I don't know. I feel like that's the theme that's uniting me here, is that I keep running around looking for fires, and I'm not finding them. I'm not finding a fire with Jordan Peterson. I'm not finding a fire with postmodern neo-Marxists. Like, I don't feel like they have their hands on the levers of government and power. I happen to disagree with them on a number of empirical things, but
I guess that brings up the Burt Weinstein Evergreen State College, because there's one situation in which, at least in a sense, there was power there. Some of those students, because the police were not involved and the president was kind of kowtowing to the students, you had groups of students wandering the campus with baseball bats. And you had something that looked like it could actually become dangerous. And there was a moment when the police did come, and these students confronted the police, and it was quite an intense scene, and they demanded the police take their guns off, strip, take away their weapons. And
they demanded that of the police?
Yeah, and because it's so...
The campus?
No, it was real
security
police.
guards or police?
Police. If I have it correct... If I'm remembering it correctly, they asked her to remove her weapons, which for a police officer is such a humiliation that she agreed to go home and change into regular civilian clothes and come back in civilian clothes, because the students felt it was, and they asked the president, when they were talking to him, they asked him to put his hands down by his sides and not gesticulate with his hands because it felt too aggressive, microaggression. So you started to see that when there was power, it was starting to go down a slippery slope. And so I agree with you, Matt. The far left doesn't have the kind of power that the right does or the far right does. But I think what I hear Peterson saying is that, like, the ideology, like some of the guiding ideology, if given the power tomorrow, there could be just as much of a catastrophe if the ideology, if the psychology is not able to, there's such a splitting, there's such a black and white thinking, there's such of us versus them, and you see that playing out in this broader cultural discussion of Peterson and the intellectual dark web thinkers, you start to see strains of intolerance and splitting and us versus them, and anything they say, it's just, if you toe the line, there's so hard to have dialogue or see between that. Yeah, maybe Peterson's saying some pretty provocative and bad things. Maybe he's kind of a prick and a jerk or an asshole, but that doesn't mean nothing that he said could be of value. That's what's shocking to me.
Yeah. He seems like a nice enough guy to me. He seems like a normal human being I've seen him admit his flaws. I've seen him, own up to the fact that he has a bit of a temper and he wishes he could get a handle on it. And I, like I said, I agree with his critiques of that dynamic that you're articulating, that went on at Evergreen, which is it's the example that I always point to as evidence of the fact that there's clearly a problem here. Burt Weinstein should not be taking up all of these students' attention as the source of the evil that they're trying to root out of the world.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Burt Weinstein,
he's definitely not the fire.
He was a Bernie
either.
supporter and Occupy Wall Street supporter.
I know. He's an ally.
Yeah.
And the fact that because he had questions about what an equity council wanted to do on campus, not about their ends, but about the means with which they were trying to, he felt, misguidedly deploy to reach those ends. He wanted to have a conversation about something, about hiring practices being changed without any of the faculty getting to discuss what that might mean academically. That kind of discussion wasn't allowed.
Right.
And he got painted as a racist because he had questions.
Right.
So clearly there's a problem there. And I think the left needs to work on that.
It definitely does. It's a question of who the what I was saying about the kind of power that the left has is cultural power relates to
it's waning. It's losing that power very quickly.
It's waning, and
why?
They seem to deserve to lose it. And it's hard to say. Like when you say the left, do you mean Democrats? I don't really mean Democrats because it's not like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and the Democratic National Convention don't have enormous amounts of power of their own.
They do,
That's not
but they've also been losing elections for a long time.
Sure, but
so
I'm just you raise this distinction between the power of the military-industrial complex, say,
right, and the neoliberal left, which is the Democratic Party, basically, is part of that.
And to me, the Democrats have a tremendous amount of power in that context.
They voted. The Democrats voted for the budget to increase military spending.
I don't think that's what we're talking about here. When we're talking about the left on the university, we're talking about something a little bit further left. Not necessarily kind of full communist left, but a progressive left, but the farther left.
The Marxists on the left and the identity politics people are not friends.
No, that's true.
Right?
That's true because there's a whole. If you want to get into the weeds about this and this whole conversation around like cultural Marxism and has Marxism itself been kind of dumbed down and diluted into this discourse about. It's become what Marx called false consciousness in a sense. It's mistaking ideology it's taking ideology for the truth instead of looking at the underlying material economic conditions that generate the ideology.
Right.
But I think what you're talking about is it's a conversation about who gets to produce culture, because culture has to be produced. We think of culture as something that's just there and that we all are born into, and it's just kind of an environment that we exist in. But no, it has to be remade every day, again and again and again, through narratives, through images, through media, through advertising, through stories, through all of these, through the knowledge that we're able to make, through what we consider to be true, what we consider to be false, what are the conditions under which something is true or is false. Those things are all up for grabs all of the time. And on some level, that's what this debate is about to me, is who gets to make culture. And that's why the media angle is so interesting to me. And I don't mean media like the mainstream media. I mean the medium. And what we're going through right now is a shift from the legacy media, which is centralized and top-down, to a bottom-up, decentralized media,
right?
Which the rules of those two are very different, very different. And I think
And that's a part of how Trump rose to power. Twitter.
He understood that.
Yeah.
And he sensed not just that people were unhappy with the status quo in terms of politics, but that they didn't want to interact with culture in the same way anymore. And they had the means to interact with it otherwise. And that's all of these guys that you're talking about, the intellectual dark web, which sounds like like we're playing Dungeons and Dragons now, and it's kind of silly, but they all are in that other media space. Right. And it turns out that, in my opinion, it's a better space. It's a better medium.
It's
in some ways.
It's a longer term. You have 2 or 3 hour podcasts and interviews where you can really start to tease things apart. It's very different than the clips and the out of context headlines. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of different pieces, but I agree. I think that's what I love about Jordan Greenhall and Daniel Schmachtenberger, is they really have their fingers on the pulse about a lot is changing right now.
I don't know much about those two.
You got to help me.
Well, I mean, Greenhall makes a big deal about the shift from legacy media to social media, and that Trump is like the first social media president because he didn't need the big networks and the big newspapers to frame him in the right way to get elected.
Right.
He literally gave the finger to those outlets.
But so in terms of your
himself.
dichotomy of power, the media, their involvement in helping to elect presidents is enormous.
Totally.
So in that sense, that's like where it kind of does veer into kind of actual.
Well, and this was one of the big
power.
I don't know that it was a revelation. I think anyone who was paying attention knew this already. But when the Democratic National Committee's emails were leaked, and we saw the amount of I'll use the word collusion going on between the major media outlets, the legacy media outlets, and the Hillary campaign. It's like, okay, this is pageantry. This is all curated.
Right.
This isn't an actual democratic debate about who has the best solutions to our problems. The decision's already been made for us by these cultural elites who curate politics for us. Because I think in terms of what legacy media think about the deplorables, right? The average person.
I was just gonna
we're not smart enough to figure out what's best for us. We need to be told what's best for us. And the intellectual dark web is the backlash, the reaction.
It's the reaction. But I think there's good news in that story because people are much smarter than Hillary Clinton thinks they are.
This is also playing out throughout Europe. I mean, this is a global phenomenon, not just an American phenomenon. And there's a big move towards the right, especially by leaders and by governments. And it's so confounding. A lot of people on the left were trying to understand what's going on. Why is so much moving to the right? We thought we were coasting with Obama. We thought we were just on a runaway.
Well, I think that's your answer right there.
Right.
You
Certainty.
Coasting. But let's talk about that for a second, because I heard and it's hard in this new media landscape to like cite, where did you hear that criticism or who said that? And you just kind of,
it's a cloud.
You get on, you get on various social media channels and you kind of get a cloudy zeitgeist feel for what's going on. But so I heard one person say about Jordan Peterson, we don't have to think about this guy. We don't have to worry about it. Because he's a pre-modern thinker. We went through these ideas. We demonstrated them to be empirically false, and we moved on. And so let's not do this retrograde thing.
Right.
And I'm sitting there thinking, how is this guy who's talking about multivariate statistical analysis and genes and heredity and personality types, how is that pre-modern? Like, it's not. He's using sophisticated tools of analysis to make his claims.
Yeah, and that triumphalist view of history, I think, is part of the problem too.
But my question to Jesse is, when we say that, I think there is a resurgence of a kind of a dangerous right wing, but when I see a guy like Jordan Peterson, who's more of who are these people? The intellectual dark web. Burt Weinstein's obviously very left, but a lot of these other people are, self-described sort of classical liberals, but they're classical liberals, which we could call a kind of libertarianism, with today's empirical understanding of the world. And so Peterson has these kind of Enlightenment values about equality of opportunity and, universal rights for all people. And he doesn't seem to be upset about gay people. I mean, he's on tour with Dave Rubin right now. He's a gay man. He doesn't actually, for all the heat that's been generated, doesn't actually seem to have any problem with transgender people as such. Gay rights, all of these things. It doesn't seem to be about race for him. So in what sense is that conservative in the 1980s, 1970s sense of conservative? This is a different thing.
Yeah, and to me this does bring up, Ken Wilber and this idea of like stages of development, evolution, like kind of looking at humanity. And
I'm so mad you brought up Ken Wilber right now. Go on.
I know you didn't want me to bring him up.
Please go on.
But I think there's something to that perspective, spiral dynamics. Ken Wilber's a philosopher who likes
I draw the line at spiral dynamics.
But when you're talking about evolution of consciousness and the evolution, he, on the backs or on the shoulders of Gebser and folks who talked about developmental models, as if, when we talk about children developing, we don't expect a 6-year-old to understand a lot of adult things, because we know, without even thinking about it, children evolve, children develop, their brain develops, they develop, and with development, you grow the capacity to better understand, relate to, and make decisions in the world. That's a clear understanding in psychology. And what some people like Gebser or Wilber are talking about is that exists collectively as humans evolve through agricultural revolutions, industrial revolutions, scientific revolutions. And so he talks, that whole idea about pre-modern, modern, postmodern. So that dovetails with Peterson and some of these intellectual dark web folks talking about postmodernism, who a lot of people critique. And I know that's a whole another can of worms. But that's what I wonder about with Peterson and some of these folks.
It's a new thing. It's a new thing. I don't know about.
Is he ethnocentric or no?
I don't know about Gebser and that the collective evolution of consciousness. When I say I don't know, I mean I don't know. But I think it's a mistake to think that this is some retrograde conservatism.
Right.
Whatever it is, it's not that. It's not liberalism. It's not progressivism as it's been understood.
It's a new emergence. It's something new.
It's a different thing. And I think that's half of the problem. And, speaking of dangerous postmodern thinkers, Michel Foucault has some really nice passages. I think it's in the Archaeology of Knowledge. Where he talks about how when the new shows up, it has to show up as monstrous. And what is monstrous? So the monstrous is the unclassifiable. Mm-hmm. It doesn't fit into the categories, and so it looks like just pure aberration. Mm-hmm. And then once it kind of gets closer and you can look at the thing, you can kind of realize what it actually is. But the new is always monstrous. Hmm. And so to me, looking for monsters is kind of a good strategy for looking for the edge, because whatever the edge is, it's going to find monsters. And
you have to account for the resonance. Peterson and some of these folks, they're touching a nerve. It's resonating across the political spectrum. A lot of folks like us on the left are engaging with them.
Left libertarians are into Peterson. Right libertarians are into Peterson. The alt-right is more right authoritarian. They're into that identity politics, like white power. Mm-hmm. And the left authoritarians into identity politics for marginalized people are not. So there's clearly he's cutting the left-right political spectrum in a way that is not easy for a lot of people to categorize. Mm-hmm. It's not just Peterson that did this. Trump did this. I mean, we're going through a mutation. I mean, I think Jean Gebser, the Swiss cultural phenomenologist who you're mentioning, would describe what we're going through as a mutation. And there's a period of chaos where an old structure is collapsing and the new structure hasn't yet emerged, and nobody knows what the hell is going on.
Right. And it's freaking everybody out.
Everyone's freaking out. And why is...
I like it. I kind of like it.
Something new is happening.
Yeah.
So it's exciting. We're on an adventure.
I'm on
here,
guard.
We don't know where
I'm
it's
on
going.
guard because I'm in a new territory. So
yeah, I mean,
it's like sleeping in a new bed at night in a new home. You're like every little creak and sound is like, what was the fuck was that? And then, but so we can't keep doing what we were doing.
Here's why I think Peterson is so popular right now. There are a lot of millennial men who are in their 30s now, and most of them are white, and they're not doing as well as their parents were. And they're pissed off about that, and they're not sure what went wrong. And some of those guys are becoming socialists because they're blaming capitalism, and some of those guys are into Peterson, and they're moving more, not necessarily to the right, but becoming more libertarian. Mm-hmm. And Peterson's giving them a scapegoat. As much as he talks about individual responsibility, and when he's on message and being a clinical psychologist, talking as a self-help guru, I think he's actually pretty good at that. I feel empowered when he starts doing that. Mm-hmm. I like that individual responsibility message. I don't think it needs to undermine the social justice message. I think both of those can work in concert. But I think these men who aren't getting as wealthy as their parents were, they can't buy houses, they're not able to establish themselves, they're not living out the American dream as they were told by their parents that they'd be able to, they're mad. And Peterson's giving them a scapegoat. Postmodern neo-Marxism, right? Political correctness. There's your scapegoat. That's the reason that your life isn't as good as you want it to be. So destroy that enemy, and then maybe you'll get the power and the success and the prestige that you want.
I do think I agree with that. I think there's a way he's scapegoating that can be problematic. I would agree with that. Again, it also kind of speaks to this postmodern whirlpool of relativism.
Yeah.
We no longer know what truth is. Everything's post-truth. Everything can be spun. Conspiracy theories and fake news. And a part of that, and you guys know postmodern philosophy much better than I do, but I think there is truth to the fact that a lot of people, whether they know it or not, are feeling this ontological anxiety or just confusion. In all throughout history, we've had cosmologies, mythologies, religions that have ordered the way we exist in the world and relate to the world. Universal truths. That's pretty much been torn down, deconstructed.
Right.
And so there's this whirlpool of total, whether it's nihilism and just atheism or confusion, and you have a whole smorgasbord, the New Age to a whole host of things. And I think when he speaks about postmodernism, I think that also really resonates with people who it's like, we don't know what's going on, but it's not all right now. It's really...
All right. I really like this phrase, and I know you do too, Adam, where he used it in the monk debate, and he's been running with it in his more recent interviews, this idea that we need a low-resolution grand narrative. Low resolution in the sense that it can include a little bit of diversity about the details, but that it's still a grand narrative, right? It's not every detail of our lives spelled out like the 10 Commandments, like here's everything you're supposed to do and not do, although he does have his 12 rules for life. But it's more like a story about what the human being is, what the human condition is, and what the hell we're supposed to be doing here with each other. It gives us a sense of common mission and purpose. And right now, the closest thing we have to that is provided by capitalism, which is, I want to get some.
And humans need that.
Consumption.
Humans need a common goal, belonging. I mean, there's core almost biological needs.
And the question is...
They're not almost. They are biological.
Yeah, they are.
I don't even think Peterson is necessarily... I mean, he's very good at popularizing Jungian psychology and looking at the Bible, a set of myths and stories that has shaped a large portion of human beings on this planet today. It cuts across Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, at least. And there are plenty of similarities about the stories around Buddha and Jesus, and it's really cross-cultural,
right?
And it's coming out of Jung's understanding of the collective unconscious. And a lot of people on the left will try to pin Nazism on Jung, because he wasn't fast enough to get out of Germany when Hitler was rising, and he wasn't fast enough to distance himself, right? And as someone who does really value archetypal psychology and the depth perspective of the nature of the unconscious and how it shapes human activity and human perception and human thought, I want to retrieve Jung And Peterson is doing a good job of that.
Right.
I think he doesn't seem to like the idea of archetypes, these unconscious structures being capable of dynamic evolution. He seems to see them as kind of fixed, such that, gender roles, for example, aren't something that we can mess with. I'm not so sure we can't. Like, he got really angry at this Disney movie Frozen. And
Right.
as research for this podcast, I watched that movie last night. I mean, come on, Jordan. That's like, just, there can be one Disney movie where it's not about the prince who saves the princess, and instead the princess takes some autonomy and does her own thing. I mean,
Right.
we can have one story like that. It's not going to lead to the downfall of Western civilization.
But to your point, Matt, about Peterson, amongst many things, is really bringing out this Jungian psychology to millions of people. Probably many people who have never heard of Jung or barely know about him.
Right.
And I remember reading Jung at CIS, and it's like, one of Jung's major points is that in order to avoid the 20th century catastrophes, in order for civilization at this scale, in this global scale, to survive, humans need to be self-reflexive, have self-inquiry, look into their own shadow.
The evil
Only
within.
when you look at the evil and the shadow within and recognize your own capacity for malevolence, as Peterson would say, can we not split and project it onto others and actually go to war and destroy this planet? And along with climate change, we're at a critical moment. Like, we don't have much time. And I think anything or anyone that points us towards moving inwards and grappling with our own unconscious and our own shadows is really an important thing right now, more than ever, to avoid this polarization.
One of the things that I do appreciate about what he's doing and saying is he raised in one of his interviews this he was talking about personal responsibility and self-development and gaining competence and being honest with yourself about why you are where you are and why the world is kind of the way it is for you. And I think it was some young guy was saying, nobody's told me that I need to be responsible for these things. And he's like, right, that's what I'm saying. That's the problem. And what I'm taking from that is that there's a kind of a cultural emphasis on figuring out how to, I don't want to say lower the bar, but I guess I do mean lower the bar, where if there's some aspect of your life or your skill set or your appearance or your ability in any way, that the move is to kind of construct an environment where you continually feel good about where you're at, regardless of whatever deficit that might be. Yeah. And he's saying, no, you're not good at something. That's why you feel bad. Mm-hmm. Get good at something and you'll feel better.
Yeah.
And that's not something that I really take from him and find interesting in him. That's just something that I have found very helpful in my own life, in my own, I kind of don't understand how we got to a place culturally where that person that Peterson is talking about never got that message. Because that's kind of the first thing that I'm doing, whatever my sort of geographic or cultural location is.
Right.
The best thing I can do is train myself up and engage the dynamic in the best way that I can. And that's uncomfortable and that's difficult. And there's not a lot of that on the left. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of personal accountability in that sense.
Right.
That I didn't train very hard, that's why I'm not very good.
And on the left, people are really, in important ways, looking at the externals. You understand systems of oppression, systemic racism, systemic sexism that operates in the structures of society. It's very much, we're great at spotting the external.
Well, it's related to the blank slate thing that Matt was saying, is that this kind of, this loose worldview understands the person and their perspective and their ability to be kind of completely malleable by the forces around them. It's made out of the forces around them.
Right.
And that's just not true. We all meet these circumstances in different ways, and that's why it's why the blank slate thing doesn't make sense. It's why the equity thing doesn't make sense. But it is why blank slate thinking and equity thinking hang together logically. So at least internally, if blank slateism was true, equity would be the thing to aim for.
Sure. So the thing is, I think clearly human beings are different enough that even if we had perfect equality of opportunity, we wouldn't have perfect equality of outcome.
Absolutely not.
The thing is, I think despite the inherited differences, in terms of various markers, if we did actually have something approaching equality of opportunity so that children all had access to schools where they went to learn rather than just be kept in prisons for 8 hours a day, and, which we're not there at this point. But if we had that, I think that human beings are similar enough that we would have, we would make huge progress in terms of inequality just by providing that early education at an equal level to children across all socioeconomic and ethnographic backgrounds.
Right.
But that becomes another one of those weird statements where who would disagree? I'm
not saying that anyone would disagree, but we're not actually putting our money that we have as a society in that direction to solve that problem.
I agree 100%. But the conversation ends up getting convoluted in such a way that people will say things like, well, Jordan Peterson doesn't believe that all people should have access to education. It's like, well, he doesn't say that. And who would say that? Who would say that only these people should be educated? Well, I don't see anybody saying that. It's just a question of how do we get everybody educated? How do we actually generate equal opportunity? That's the only question.
I'm a firm believer in education. As you know, if there's the simplest way I can come up with a solution, though there are plenty of other problems and this won't solve everything, is that we need to invest more in education and less in incarceration. I mean, this is a Bernie Sanders talking point, right? And it sounds nice, but I think it would actually work.
And I mean, there's so many things that are wrong right now. You bring up mass incarceration, you bring up the issues of food, of education, of climate change, you could go on and on. It's so complicated, right? And I think everyone's trying to figure out, how do we address this? What is going on? But what I think is interesting is this idea of something new that's emerging, because, the idea that something new needs to emerge in order to understand and grapple with the problems that are happening right now with this level of complexity. And this guy, Jordan Greenhall, talks a lot about sovereignty being connected to sense-making. Sense-making is a human's capacity to literally make sense of the world around them and then make decisions from there. And a part of what's happening is we're actually we're degrading our capacity for sense-making. It's too much data, too much information overload, and there's overwhelm. You have things like, intergenerational trauma, systemic levels of trauma in different populations. And so there's a lot of perspectives we can look at this.
Well, that's kind of comes back to this needing for a narrative,
right?
Some kind of low resolution narrative that situates us, and that's why I'm a little bit perplexed by some people closer to our communities that take such offense to the kinds of moves that Jordan Peterson is making, because they're the same kinds of moves that a lot of people we know have been striving to make.
Yeah.
I mean, almost word for word, they're the same.
The universe story is a low-resolution grand narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
Jungian psychology is a low-resolution grand narrative.
Do you think that I got the sense that, and this is just a bias that I carry, that sort of liberal bourgeois culture, sort of people who read the New Yorker or write for the New Yorker and read the New York Times and so on, there's a kind of a implicit disengagement from their bodies in a way that I think is present throughout a lot of history. And so when someone says, or when someone like Jordan Peterson says, "You're like a lobster," and they kind of go, "I'm nothing like a lobster. What do you take?" It gets this Victorian kind of human anthropocentrism about it, or the fact that maybe they're acting out from you know, a less than rational place, like somehow like their body is involved, their sex drive is involved. Like these things are in play at, you know, in all kinds of public spaces, and they kind of just deny that that's true. There's a kind of a weird rejection of the body and a weird rejection of the evolutionary history that we carry with us in our decision making in various ways. And it's interesting to see that play out again in 2018.
Right.
A kind of a rejection of that connection to the corporeal, the bodily, the evolutionary.
Yeah. I'm not that convinced that human rationality can, you know, this is what the radicals tried to do during the French Revolution, is just start fresh, cut off tradition, create a new calendar, fuck religion. Let's just start from scratch and build a society using science and rationality.
Right.
And they ended up with the reign of terror, and they're all killing each other.
Right.
Because they weren't doing it right. Like everyone was like, you're not being rational in the right way, and you know, you're a spy, and like you're undermining the whole thing. And so the human animal nature is not something that we can just dispense with. We can't pretend like we don't have these unconscious drives that shape our desires. And, you know, one of the insidious things that Russell Brand was pointing out that capitalism has grown so proficient at is playing to these drives.
Exploiting them.
Identifying
them. What they are and then exploiting them.
Right. And we're not going to forget that knowledge. Right? Human beings are pretty, in terms, especially statistically, you know, maybe individuals have certain capacities that allow them to slide through these traps, but overall we're pretty predictable, and we can be controlled via the media. And it was, you know, legacy media has one way of doing it. Social media has its own algorithmic magic that's going on. You know, that's been in the news recently too, in terms of tailoring certain kinds of ads to certain populations.
Right.
Because, you know, neuroscientists and psychologists know how certain types of people will respond to certain information.
Right.
So we're not as rational as we think. And politics is not about facts. I get frustrated at people that think, oh, if you know those politicians are just lying and making up their facts. Politics has never been about facts. It's not supposed to be about facts. It's about frames. It's about emotional sort of perspectives on the world, and we're always going to be engaging politically on that level.
A purely rational, even if we could achieve a sort of purely rational politics, it would still be a rationality geared towards around what we should do based on what we know. Right. And what we should do can't be derived from what we know. This is what you were saying earlier. Right. So we'd still have to invent that aim of where it was going.
Right.
And that's something we would need to construct and decide upon ourselves.
And I think, you know, part of what has led to Trump taking power and this whole reaction to the status quo in Washington and in politics is the sense that neoliberal capitalism, globalization, led to this sense that there are experts who have mastered these technologies, and they know how and what how human beings work and what human beings should be doing, and they can fix the problems in these rationalistic ways. And there was a kind of elitism where these Ivy League educated people were running the world, and the common person felt like they were being talked down to, and like they were not getting
well, in some cases they literally were being talked down to.
They were. And that type of politics led to an angry reaction. And where a lot of people I think a lot of people voted for Trump who didn't even like the guy.
Right. And that's where it kind of gets to this question that I'm wrestling with around the role of the left in generating the phenomenon of Trump. And I think that's something that deplorables, shaming folks.
I don't think they generated Trump, but they empowered.
Empowered.
Yeah.
I think what they might have done is moved a lot of people from the center towards the right, or people who were just angry. It's something like 80% of voters who identified as angry voted for Trump.
I think the big story about the election in 2016 was the number of people in the Rust Belt who had voted for Obama in 2012.
Right, exactly.
Who then voted for Trump in 2016.
So the racism argument doesn't work so well there.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of go back a moment to Jonathan Haidt, because what I think is such a problem, kind of just to go back to the left, and I know I'm using that term loosely, and it's good to be more specific with definitions, but is around this self-righteousness, but also just kind of certainty that we have such a monopoly on truth and what's real and what the dynamics are. And I think something that I thought was really interesting about Jonathan Haidt, who's a liberal, and he's never voted for a Republican ticket in his whole life, but he started researching for his book, The Righteous Mind, which is about political psychology. And so he started reading a lot of, for the first time in his life, conservative thinkers and philosophers and whatnot. And he just his mind started opening. And he did a lot of research for 8 years before writing that book. I'm reading that book right now, and it's fascinating. And what he's putting together and realizing is that he talks about morality as like having taste buds, that there's like, he identifies 5 primary kind of taste bud receptors of morality, that humans are actually wired almost biologically, or not almost, perhaps biologically, to have different forms of morality. And on the left, we're primarily focused with justice and care. So it's about harm and it's about care. Is any harm committed? You ask any liberal and they'll say, if they ask you something, what's moral? Is something moral or not moral? It's about, was anybody harmed? And is it like fair? Is it just? And our sense of justice. But he says those are only just 2 of these morality lines.
Right.
And there's actually 3 others. He identifies them as loyalty, as authority, and as sanctity. So sanctity is connected to the divine and to spiritual and to religion, which the right completely dominates. The left doesn't know how to speak to voters about all 3 of those. We're so anti-authoritarian. We so easily have fear and anger towards any kind of hierarchy or power. We see it only as corrupt, as oppressive. And same with loyalty, so patriotism, the left is really bad at like speaking to these fundamental human needs around stuff like patriotism, belonging, the nation, authority and power, and also sanctity around spiritual and religious impulses in the human being. And so he talks as a chapter about the conservative advantage, which is that the conservatives also speak about care and harm, that kind of justice, but also about these other 3. So they're operating on all 5 of these taste bud, receptors of the human form of morality. But the liberals and the left only work on 2. And it's always a question, why do the liberals keep losing elections? Why do we keep shooting ourselves in the foot? And I think it really speaks to the left. We need to grapple with these ideas with figures like Peterson and start to learn from folks on the right, from folks in the middle. Like, we need to open and broaden our horizons.
Yeah, it's like the Democratic Party only speaks to a quarter of the human being, right?
Well, what you're saying, I think, is really consequential to the discussion we were having about the liberal constitution of universities and some of the kind of adjacent conversations that have been going on in the midst of this shift, in the midst of this left-right debate, is just how is it that you read in a sort of generic liberal secular context, in a university context, how do you read religious texts? How do you read even the sort of the great inspired, let's call them inspired texts of Western civilization, or of anybody's civilization, those texts that are clearly religiously inspired, spiritually inspired, revelatory texts, but aren't sort of part of the official Christian narrative or Jewish narrative. The great poets, the great philosophers, and the great writers who don't have a sort of secular bias to them. How do those ideas get taken up in these postmodern contexts? They get taken up as questions about history and cultural context and power, and what do these texts reveal about the power relations of that time.
Right.
All interesting questions, all worth asking. But to your point about which of those 5 areas are they addressing, do any of them actually address the sanctity of these texts?
Right.
And the answer is probably no. If you say, this great work of poetry, William Blake is actually kind of having a revelatory experience that means something outside of its social political context,
Right.
that's probably not something you're getting a lot of in a very secular context.
No,
Whereas like the real charge in reading William Blake is, I want to say, is reading it literally, in a sense. That actually is what's happening to William Blake when he writes these words.
Or at least
And
that the symbols are real.
the symbols are real, and you don't get the texts of William Blake. You don't get the texts of Rilke. You don't get the texts of any of these major figures without them engaging it with a certain sense of authenticity, that this is real, or at least I don't know what the ontological status of these pronouncements are, but to me right now, these religious experiences are real.
it's allowing to engage with the archetypal dimension and not just the personal dimension of who Blake or Rilke are. White men contextualized by their current society and culture. There's much deeper layers that I believe human beings are wired, where we connect to the numinous, the archetypal, religious impulse. It's a profoundly deep dimension of the human experience. And I agree. I think that's often missed in these.
Well, I mean, I think to my mind, that's at the root of why the three of us know each other and why we went to the school that we went to. Is we were seeking some authentic engagement with those things, which kind of makes us unusual, sort of liberal suspects, because we have all of those kind of traditional liberal concerns, but also a willingness to engage with what you're saying in Jonathan Haidt's account are traditionally right-wing values. Yeah. But so bringing those together is kind of where things get really interesting.
And we want to reclaim them. Whenever I hear the right has, dominates that domain around sanctity, I get frustrated. I'm like, why doesn't the left have power and authority to talk to voters, to just talk amongst ourselves in that dimension?
Yeah. Well, I've had this conversation with other sort of left progressives and liberals, and they're talking about the loss of spirit and meaning in society, and that it's all gone. And I've always kind of been like, what are you talking about? Most people go to church. Most people who are outside of our secular context go to church. I
mean, church attendance is dropping every year.
It's dropping, which might not be a good thing. The sort of the more conservative, discriminatory practices of traditional religions we can easily leave behind. But my point is just that there are a lot of communities in the United States where religion and spirituality and community are a regular part of everyday life.
Right. Right.
Yeah. It seems a bit hubristic to assume that we could live without religion and myth. A lot of the critical articles on Peterson go after the fact that he takes myth seriously they use that as a sign that he's a crackpot.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're clearly a pre-modern reactionary because you're taking myth seriously as something that should guide how.
In that New York Times article, they quote him saying that witches are real, or I don't think he meant literally real, but he was saying they're real.
Well, anyone who's read Jung knows what he is talking about.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
There's a kind of psychological reality, at least, to when we talk about a witch or a dragon.
And when I read that section of that New York Times article where he was saying those are real, and if you don't think they're real, you need to learn some more. I was like, right on. Someone is naming it, and he's connected to that Jungian cosmology, which I think is really important. When we lose that, we are in trouble.
Yeah, we need a relationship to the unconscious, and in some cases, I think so. Earlier, I talked about Marx and how I thought he was a little bit utopian, and I think the left inherits that utopianism, which is this notion that that we don't need to figure out practically how to get to the ideal society from where we are right now, because all of the inherited structures of society are just bad and unjust, and we just need to overthrow them and start fresh in a more rational way where everyone's equal.
Right.
And the problem is that where human beings are, we have this umbilical cord that ties us to the cosmos, and we're part of this evolutionary process that's billions of years old. And, you know, when we talk about conservatism and progressivism, it's not like it's pretty simple-minded to say, oh, well, I'm a progressive and conservatism is bad. Well, you know, as animals, there are lots of core metabolic processes that we definitely need to conserve in order to survive.
Right.
And I think that analogy holds if we transfer it to certain social processes, social structures. We may be able to envision an ideal form of society and compare it to the present and say, wow, there are a lot of things wrong, we need to fix that. But to think that we can just leap to the perfected society and not think about the bridge that we build to get there is dangerous, because that's what led to
and revolutions
the
are
20th
bloody
century.
And it's like I can get that impulse. You know, I was talking with my friend, and you know, I think Peterson uses the metaphor of a ship, where it's like people are saying this system isn't working, people are suffering, people are starving, let's tear it down and build a new one. Well, you don't want everyone to fall into the ocean.
When you're at sea,
the chaos of ocean, you know, you need to actually find a way to build a new ship and then transfer it over. Or it's like the bridge.
You stay afloat the whole time.
The New Bay Bridge. They didn't just tear down the New Bay Bridge. They built the new bridge beside it. And then when it was completed, they then dismantled the old one. There's some kind of a transition. And I think it's understandable that folks who are really struggling and suffering, they get, you know, that's where Peterson talks about resentment and bitterness. They fall prey to resentment and rage and say, well, if they can have stuff and I don't have it, like, let's just tear the whole fucking thing down. And I think that's dangerous. And it's also to this point that I love what Peterson talks about, these traits. Liberals are often high in trait openness and in agreeableness. Conservatives typically are often higher in trait conscientiousness and industriousness. And so often you have folks who are high in openness in Silicon Valley. They're great at startups. They start and they're innovative and they're creative. They think outside the box and they start these amazing companies and organizations. But then conservatives are much better at coming in and running these companies. They can do the closing. Humans you don't have to be good at everything. We can play different roles. So I think progressives and conservatives, to use those simplistic terms, really need each other in this dialectic.
Well, we were talking before we turned the mics on that's the kind of the benefit of having a systems perspective. And that's, for me, it's not always about having my position or what's my team or what's my dog in this race. It's not really about that. It's about plugging into a situation and looking where the center of gravity is, or where most people are, and looking at what that group of people might be missing, and then thinking about is there a risk in what they're missing? And if there is a risk, okay, let me identify what that risk is, and then kind of constellate myself as an actor in that scenario that will kind of fill that niche. And that doesn't mean that I don't have my own personal beliefs, my own personal values that kind of transcend those conditions. But for me, it's very much what you're saying. We need this kind of interplay of different kind of characteristics and trait types. And some of us, I think, can plug into a number of those kind of roles depending on the situation. I know I can kind of identify a situation that's running well and say, okay, we just need to keep running this program. Let's figure out how to do that. Or this program is clearly not working. We need to figure out how to change it. And I can kind of plug in and be that way.
And I often think about the archetypes in terms of astrology, and I see the conservatives or Peterson carrying some really strong Saturn energy, which is about responsibility, discipline, structure,
Senex.
routine, Senex, order. And I think liberals, leftists, I know it's, you know, I don't know if it's Neptune or Uranus. Uranus is innovative,
Uranus,
change, what's new, looking into the future. It's fast-paced, like change now. And I think all of us, all human beings, have both Saturn and Uranus. We need to have a relationship to all the planetary archetypes and energies, those dimensions. And I think kind of collectively, externally, we're divorced from, it's as if conservatives are either purely evil or purely stupid, and they have nothing of value to contribute. And that's a bad recipe.
Right. You know, the first time I listened to Peterson, I was troubled and frustrated and angry, because I was like, I need to respond to this guy. And what I came to realize is that there's some charm there. There's some charisma. And, you and I and a friend of ours went to go see him live and in person in San Francisco a few weeks ago. And I was impressed not because I agree with what he has to say, especially politically, but I was impressed, and I value him as an interlocutor, as someone that I want to be engaged in a dialectic with, because he makes me understand myself better.
Right.
He improves my own understanding of what I think is the good, what I think is true. Right. And the left desperately needs that dialectic tension, because right now there's a lot of groupthink and a lot of echo chamber.
And we need it to beat the crazy white nationalists who are in power. We need it to beat and win elections and get good, smart people in positions of power. I genuinely believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they're in power. The sort of, I don't know if white nationalist alt-right people are in power.
Well, how would you characterize Trump or his cabinet, or
I don't know how to
or
characterize
Tea Party
him.
people? Or...
I don't know how to characterize him, and this is part of the problem that I have with the way Jordan Peterson is being caricatured, because that's a situation that I can go and evaluate for myself. I can actually go and see what he's saying, and I can compare it to the reports that are coming out about him, and I can say, as a consequence of my own rational process, that this is not an accurate representation of this person. This is a narrative-driven, ideological kind of caricature. It's a character assassination on purpose before you've even tried to figure out what this person is trying to say. And so when I look at that, I look at all of the other things that I can't evaluate and wonder about the narrative representations of those things and say, well, okay, if these, and I can't think of another example right now, but there are a lot of, we've all read, The Stone in the New York Times and thought, well, geez, this is a really bad characterization of this philosophical position or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, I honestly don't know how to evaluate what's going on some of these higher levels, because I can't go and check it out for myself. But I do know that the media, in the spaces that I can check it out, the media organizations that give me these narratives aren't doing very well.
So in terms of militarism, in terms of deporting immigrants, in terms of even the ecological crisis, if we look at things that Obama was doing versus what Trump is doing, mm-hmm. Or what Hillary would be doing.
Well, the immigration policy is a good example, because that
plenty of people were being deported under Obama,
and that's what I was about to say.
More than any president prior.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Is that the Obama policy and the Trump policy doesn't seem to me that different.
But what Trump is saying, like when he says that, MS-13, they're animals, and we're deporting them by the thousands, but there's still thousands of them here, and we have to find them and root them out and send them back. What he's doing is empowering his supporters.
Did he say they were deporting them by the thousands?
Yeah. What he's doing is empowering his supporters to think of any Spanish-speaking person as a potential gang member, and he's empowering them to act as vigilantes on behalf of their country to get these people out of here who they think don't belong here. So it's, in terms of his rhetoric, he's obviously, I think it's plain as day, he's a white nationalist, or at least he's pandering to white nationalists so he gets their support. I don't think there's any ambiguity whatsoever about what's going on in the White House right now.
And I agree with that. I hear what you're saying, Adam. You're reluctant to name something you don't understand. It's not clear.
Here's what's not clear to me: how many white nationalists, in that strict sense, there really are.
Enough that Trump was elected, and enough
we just identified like a pretty
enough
clear
that he
case.
can dog whistle over and over
Right.
and over again every single
I'm
day,
glad
and
you
the whole Republican
Yeah.
Party is not doing anything to stop him.
And Charlottesville was pretty disturbing.
Charlottesville is super disturbing.
And I think, I know you hate this the Wilburian thing, but it's kind of like if green meme is regressive, it resulted in I see Trump as almost like solid red, like red or amber, like.
Well, you're gonna have to explain.
I'm gonna have to
what all
post a
of
link
those-
to Spiral
Okay,
Dynamics
sorry,
for
that's
our
too
audience.
complicated.
But
yeah.
let me I want to go to go back a step, because you said it's obviously a dog whistle. And that's one of the things that really had me in this loop with Jordan Peterson is, okay, are these attributions made about him accurate? No, they're not. Okay, so is there something kind of diabolically going on under the radar? Is he saying one thing but signaling something else? Is he shooting off a bunch of dog whistles that other people will hear? And I'm looking for these things called dog whistles now, and because that's part of the conversation. And I'm wondering how do you separate that? Because so many people would say that Jordan Peterson is just shooting off dog whistles. He's just blowing dog whistles right and left. But you don't think it so in that case?
I don't think so. I think Peterson's willing to have conversations about issues like, IQ and race, but he'll admit that race is a very fuzzy category and scientifically it's meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
But he'll just say that IQ is inherited, right? And that's something that's taboo on the left.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see that as a dog whistle. I see that as him saying we need to have this conversation. If we do care about justice, if we
Right.
do care about equity, we need to deal with this. It's an inconvenient truth,
Right.
right? And whether or not those differences in IQ are just innately biological, or whether or not there's some epigenetic thing going on where people in low-income communities, because of environmental pollutants or whatever, develop in a certain way, and that actually gets inherited by the next generation.
Sure.
There are many complicated factors here. We need to deal with them, right? And the left wants to pretend like any child born anywhere can be put in the right conditions and become the president, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I see Peterson wanting to have politically incorrect conversations that the left wants to stay away from because it doesn't fit into their ideological view.
But in
of
a
what
good
human
faith kind of
rational
evidentiary way.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think so.
I think so too.
I think, Trump he's intelligent in a certain kind of manipulative way. He understands how television works. He understands how the media works.
Yeah.
And
the debate for me, just to be clear, is not whether or not he's a good president or not. The debate for me is whether or not it's intentionally sinister and sort of white ethno-nationalism, or if he's just a kind of a power-hungry nihilist who doesn't really know what he's doing.
I think it is that. But he's pandering to certain and
those
empowering
are the two
forces.
options for me.
Trump
just
is
to
an
be
empty
clear.
shell. I don't even think he knows what he thinks.
Yeah.
All he wants is to make himself and his family richer.
But see, that's what I'm saying. Like,
But he's
I don't know.
empowering a certain group, a certain sector of America, and giving voice to a certain kind of rhetoric that is revitalizing and re-entrenching certain racial dynamics that have been with this country forever, and that are now resurgent.
Mm-hmm.
And does he really himself believe it? Is he a white supremacist? I don't think he thinks about that stuff.
I don't think he does.
I think
either.
he's a pragmatist who wants to enrich himself.
Mm-hmm.
He's an empty shell.
And I like what you said, that because I don't think he's just dumb. I think he is smart in certain ways. My mom would always call him a genius, but I agree. I think it's in a manipulative way. He understands intuitively, kind of
Right.
like people on a sociopathy or something. They can intuitively feel people and know how to say anything that will hook them and manipulate them. And I think he's done that amazingly well. And I think, I just don't think he really has clear identities or,
I'm not sure he does either.
philosophies.
But I'm just wondering, my question is about this sort of resurgence of white nationalism, or whatever you want to talk about, whatever you want to call it. And then thinking about that question of the resurgence of it in the context of what we were just talking about, Jordan Peterson, because a lot of the people that we've been criticizing would cite Jordan Peterson as evidence of resurgent white nationalistic patriarchy. And we've just spent a lot of time saying, no, that's probably not accurate in this case.
Mm-hmm.
So how many of those other cases is it not accurate of? I agree that what we saw in Charlottesville actual white nationalism. When you hear Richard Spencer talk, actual white nationalism, and that's why getting this right is so important to me, because I actually really care about the resurgence of that kind of thinking, because it's devastating.
So there are
but
people
so how many other, do you know what I'm saying? How many other Petersons are there? And if we can identify all of them, what does that do to the discourse about resurgent white nationalism?
So, this is something that I've been pointing out to people who do think that Jordan Peterson is a white supremacist. I have learned from my own education in universities and my own study of critical theory and postmodernism that there's actually a little white supremacist in everyone, and there's a little fascist in everyone. This is part of human nature.
Right.
And so to pretend like, oh, the racists are over there and we need to be better than them because I'm pure, and I'm pure because I know that I'm not one of them, that's to deny your own shadow.
Sure.
Right.
And so I'm not here to say that Jordan Peterson doesn't have some racist or white supremacist tendencies. I'm not here to say that I don't have those.
Right.
That's part of the challenge of this,
right,
is that these things are deeply rooted and we don't consciously decide. The danger with people like Richard Spencer is that identity politics has been used by white nationalists to consciously say, oh, well, you say black power, I say white power, let's battle it out.
Right.
But you bring up the good question of like Donald Trump being like the perfect canvas for projection. Like we could project everything around white power and white supremacy and racism onto him and somehow disown any of ours. We don't have to think about handling how that exists in us.
So let's grant Matt his point that there's a little fascist inside me, there's a little fascist inside everybody. But the three of us are not, we're not a problem.
Depends who you ask.
Well, yes, but do you know what I'm saying?
Let's wait for the reaction to this podcast.
But in terms of resurgent fascism, it's not, even if that tendency exists in everybody, and we should acknowledge that shadow side to human instinct and human nature, which is important. It's ludicrous to me to think that, just like it's ludicrous to think that Burt Weinstein is the problem at Evergreen. That's not a reasonable sort of threat assessment, So we can take on that discourse about a shadow being a problem, but I can tell you I'm not going to turn into some monster.
Right. So maybe
it's very unlikely.
Is what you're saying about Trump is that this just continual demonization of him is missing the point? Because the way I see
it's not just about him for me. It's about this whole like cloud of conversation that has moved so far away from what news reporting could accurately be described as real news reporting. And I'm happy to say that Fox News, I don't know, in the 80s or 90s kind of started that trend of being not the news, but of being right-wing news or right-wing sensationalism or something like that. But I think CNN is the same,
Yeah.
And it would be nice if these, right-wing Trump supporters calling CNN fake news were wrong, but then when you check out what CNN is doing, you're like, no, that is wrong. That's not real.
Yeah, no, the stuff that they
and that
cover
doesn't commit me to their side. It just says, this is an inaccurate representation.
Right. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember when Jon Stewart went on CNN's show Crossfire. Tucker Carlson used to be on that show, and he tore into the disservice and the dysfunction of mainstream media and the way that it was destroying, undermining American democracy by not allowing us to have the type of discourse that we needed to have to govern ourselves, but instead distracting everyone to focus on these controversial issues that didn't allow us to see what we actually all had in common. so that we could actually solve some real problems.
Right.
And that continues, and it's only gotten worse.
It's getting worse.
And that's what Noam Chomsky says, right? He
manufacturing of consent, and
right. He's saying like while focusing on Trump and just constant 24-hour news cycles, and really we're missing out on so many things that are actually happening of importance that we miss out on actually.
So so the Republicans run on their values. The Democrats run on not being Republicans. And the Democrats are doing it again. They just don't learn. It's like they don't want to win.
Right.
The 2018 midterm elections are coming up, and the official Democratic strategy is Trump is corrupt, and you should vote for us. Instead of, here are all our plans to deal with, violence in the inner cities and a corrupt criminal justice system and inequality, and we're going to put you back to work, and we're going to deal with Medicare, instead of coming up with programs and policies to help people.
And why do you think we do that? Why do you think the left does that? Why do you think over and over it's
because
so
the
hard?
Democratic Party is not actually wanting to disturb. How I rate it is that Democratic Party is not wanting to disturb the corporate order of things.
Neoliberal corporate order.
Yeah, they're going to double down on that as the only way. As Francis Fukuyama used to talk about the end of history in the 90s, when after the Soviet Union ended, it was global capitalism. That was the final way that humans would organize themselves. It was the best that we could do, and societies would continue to secularize, religion would die away, and then 9/11 happened. And now we've got Trump, and religion is resurgent, nationalism is resurgent, and things haven't panned out the way that we expected in the 90s. And if I was alive in the 90s, and I was, but thinking about these things, I probably would have thought, oh yeah, we've arrived. But clearly history was not over. And I feel like the Democratic Party is just, it's going to keep playing the same fucking game until it dies. And I want there to be some opposition to Trump, even if it does take the form of Democrats who continue to invest in the military-industrial complex, continue to deny people a sane healthcare system. I have very little allegiance to the Democratic Party, but they're this sole source of institutional resistance to another party that I think is way worse, and that is feeding this resurgent right wing that I find to be more dangerous than the left-wing extremists.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I don't know what's going to happen. I'm still a Bernie supporter, and I think that kind of leftism that focuses on not to deny racial injustice and gender injustice, but that focuses on wealth inequality as the problem, and focuses on getting everyone health care and education and getting people quality jobs. I think that will address a lot of the things that the social justice people want to address, but they're not looking in the right places to address it.
And that's a real hot topic. I've been in rooms with conversations where I know it's all, everyone says it's a both and, not an either or, but
right.
The conversation between race and class seems to continually come up. And I guess that runs along the lines of Hillary versus Bernie. I'm sure there's lots of ways to cut that, but I know some folks say that race is just that has to be the primary emphasis and focus. And then there's folks who are really articulating around class and economics and finance and the neoliberal kind of capitalism as the ocean in which everything is swimming. And I know it's a both and, I get that, but it just I just notice it keeps coming up, and it can be quite divisive, or it's a challenging thing for us on the left to grapple with.
Yeah. I mean, if there was a massive redistribution of wealth based on who was at the bottom getting more, and like a graduated redistribution, then people of color would get the majority of that redistributed wealth because they happen to stack up at the bottom because of those historical injustices, right? So they're not separate things. And of course, we need to do both. It's just a matter of, do we just want more people of color on corporate boards to exploit their workers, or do we want workers to have some power and some quality of life instead of having their labor stolen from them for profits profits of the people at the top.
And that brings that question we talked about earlier around reparations, or around if there was if we did try and do some kind of radical redistribution of wealth, which I am a favor of. I really think something needs to be done. The growing scale of inequality is so severe that I think it could be extremely dangerous and unstable. It's destabilizing.
So many of the problems we're facing are symptoms of inequality.
Yes.
Yeah, wealth inequality.
And then the question is always, how would we go about that? Who would oversee that? Who would decide how? I mean, it's disheartening. It's just overwhelming to think about, any of the logistics or the practicalities related to doing something like that without starting a full-blown civil war.
Well, maybe in our next podcast we can get into the practicalities of reparations. I'll do some studying up and research the topic, and
I'm sure Peterson will have some good perspectives on that.
Yeah.
Well, we started with your personal journey, kind of going through this transition. What can you give us some specific things that you're going to approach differently as a result of that transition? Some things that before you felt that experience, you would have done X, Y, and Z, but now you're going to place your emphasis here.
Yeah, it's a great question.
What's changed for you practically? Because it sounds like there's been some kind of internal psychological shift, but...
Yeah. Well, I'd say this podcast is one thing. I do feel, I feel really enlivened and really stimulated by these conversations that I've been witnessing, but also participating in with various friends, family members, and doing it with you both here on here has been wonderful. So I do feel like something that's changed for me is just asking more questions, investigating with a more open mind, and I actually feel that it's really important to kind of broach these ideas and these conversations in broader ways on the left. And I feel committed to that. I feel like, this metaphor, this image that kind of popped into my mind today while I was driving over here was, connected when some people say, why are you attacking us on the left so much? What about folks on the right? And I had this image of with escalating polarization, communication disappears and things can become violent. And if you imagine two groups of folks who are out at a party and a fight starts to break out, maybe two people bump shoulders and all of a sudden they start facing off and saying things loudly to each other, and then they start calling each other names and maybe they start shoving each other. What would happen? Someone like a friend, I'd come over to you and say, hey man, cool, it's all right, it's not worth it, don't worry about it, that guy's an idiot, it's not worth it. Someone else would be grabbing him. People try and pull them apart to prevent the escalation into full-blown violence. And I feel like on the left and the right, people are leaning in, they're seeing red, their eyes are turning red, and people are just foaming at the mouth. It's intense. And I kind of suddenly feel like I want to grab folks on my side, in my crew, my team, and say, hey, cool it, chill. They're not, it's okay. You don't need to worry about that. I feel like that's something that Martin Luther King and Gandhi would do. Show your strength by moral capacity, by self-restraint, by higher morals and higher principles. Don't fall into, the amygdala that makes you want to fight.
Right.
And so I kind of feel like I want to grab and have conversations with folks on the left who are getting a bit ideologically possessed and are losing the capacity, in my opinion, to reason and to see the other side, to have empathy, to have civil and intelligent discourse and dialectic. And so I kind of want to engage folks on the left in playful ways and also in serious ways to say, let's talk about these things and let's prevent this very scary polarization that's happened.
And I'm all for that, engaging with people on the left. I'm also
and
for engaging with people who are into Peterson and don't hang out on the left side of the political spectrum, but they're not white nationalists either.
Right.
And to try to be in dialogue with them about how they're going to cash out what Peterson is revealing to them.
That's a great point.
Because I'm not sure actually what the net effect of Peterson is on people that are in that gray zone.
Right.
I would really like to see some research on that.
That's the sense of uncertainty I was speaking to about any number of things.
But I want to be in that fray and talking to those people.
I do too.
Pulled into this orbit.
To Jesse's point, for me, it's not so much. I also want to have. I've been, a leftist person my whole life. It hasn't even occurred to me to be
right.
anything
and
else.
Nothing's changed.
I haven't had a different you talked about your liberal upbringing. I have a Swedish upbringing. My whole context is that world and that frame of politics and that frame of social democracy. It's always just seemed self-evidently right to me, and it still seems self-evidently right to me. But I want to talk to more people, on the left, just because I don't necessarily like the idea of going over to somebody else's house and telling them how to live.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in my own house and looking around at it and feeling like this shit is in disarray.
Right.
And this is where we live. Like, what are we doing? Like, these are, so it's, at least I can talk to those people in a almost a familial way, or I won't feel like I'm just showing up in a foreign land and telling people what to do.
Right. Yeah. And that's
this
my
is
metaphor.
This is a land I've been in.
The metaphor of that.
And I'm wondering, what are we doing? And I don't even want to really identify as a leftist person anymore, or a liberal progressive in the mainstream sense. And I'm aware of this debate that Matt brought up earlier between let's call them actual Marxists and sort of cultural leftists or cultural Marxists. And out of the two, I think the Marxists make more sense because they at least try to be empirically and materially driven. But I don't really identify with any of those things anymore.
Mm-hmm. The categories are shifting.
Well, everything is different, and it, I was never, I mean, you guys know me. It's not like I've ever been super invested in political movements or political ideologies at all. It's just been more of a kind of a tacit kind of assumption that social democratic policies are the right ones, and I still think they are. But the cultural dynamic is just something that, I'm not sure exactly when I sort of consciously disowned it, but I mean, it definitely happened within the past year or so, in a stronger way that, maybe it had been building up to something, but.
Right. And a part of my interest too is like, I want to help the left, reclaim sanctity, reclaim relationship to authority, reclaim relationship to loyalty, so that we can speak and operate with all 5 of those domains of values and forms of morals. And so we can also win elections and gain power and make a positive change in the world. And I believe that's deeply connected for me with social justice and liberation from oppression and helping folks, lift up into with dignity and respect. That's deeply a part of my vision.
I'm thinking just now that it's important for leftist people to bring on sanctity and tradition, not because it's going to win them elections, but because they're legitimate avenues to understand the world and human life.
There you go.
They're real things.
Yeah.
And so, I mean,
it's a good point.
So, like, at least as I read her, Hillary Clinton is this perfect example of the sort of calculating demographic machine. Like, oh, they want sanctity.
Right.
Let's signal more sanctity, and we'll get votes. Like, that's exactly why people aren't voting for her, because she's signaling sanctity, and they're living sanctity.
Right. I guess I say that also just in the sense of not challenging the left for just its own sake, but also as a part of my own commitment to help move forward social justice. With legislation as well as on core.
No, I know what you're saying. I know you're not cynical in that way.
Right.
I'm just saying, for whoever else might think it's a good idea to bring these things on, and for the sake of broadening the diversity of perspectives or something like that, like try and actually take it seriously.
Yeah.
Try and actually consider that it might be a real aspect of life.
Right. Actually, if the left were to fully retrieve the message of Martin Luther King Jr., not just the cultural message around race, but the socialism, right? The message about militarism, it was all in MLK.
Yeah.
Right.
We don't have to do better than that.
Right.
We just have to not turn him into Santa Claus.
Try to live up to, and that's true of a lot of ideals and a lot of great thinkers, that the task is still to live up to some of the things that we've set up for ourselves, because we're not there.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really good conversation, guys. It's been nice to be in dialogue with you guys.
Totally. Pleasure to think with both of you. And you know, one thing I'll add just to wrap up that I really appreciate that Peterson often says is that we can't think silently in our own heads. To think clearly, we actually need to be able to speak with one another, because we don't even know what we think as individuals until we hear ourselves say it.
Right.
And to be in dialogue with you two is a real gift. So I appreciate the camaraderie and the challenge that we all bring to each other into this conversation. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.